from the 2019 Provision Entrepreneurs Conference, here's Dan Pilla.
Gary talked last night about going to the next step and becoming an influencer and taking action as Christians to become an influencer, and that's what I want to talk about. That's what I'm going to drill into here this morning. And we're going to start with Luke chapter 2. We've all read Luke chapter 2. It's the Christmas story. We read it every single Christmas time, right? Every single Christmas time. Joseph and Mary, they have to travel to Bethlehem. They have to register for the census. They're supposed to go up, and of course there's no place at the inn, and Mary has the baby in the manger. We all know the story. Every Sunday school kid has done a play about Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem. We used to go to those Sunday school plays all the time. The school put on the plays, and our kids did the plays every year. And we go to the little play with all the little kids there reciting Luke chapter 2, right? You've all seen it. And we'd get ready to go into the school, into the gymnasium, and my wife would give me some advice about how to handle the school play. She'd say, don't laugh, keep quiet, and don't make fun of other people's kids. What she didn't understand is I was trying to help. Because that's what I do, I help. Now, and I did it in a loving way. I wasn't being mean. I mean, wouldn't you want to know, if you were standing in front of a group of 200 people, wouldn't you want to know if you were absent-mindedly picking your nose? Hey kids, stop picking your nose, would you? That's all. I did it in a loving way. But the unique aspect of Luke's gospel, and this is true of Luke's gospel, and it's true of Acts, which of course Luke wrote as well. The unique aspect of Luke himself is that Luke was a highly educated individual. Luke was not a peasant, he was not a fisherman. Luke was a physician, very intelligent person, very eloquent person. And in fact, Luke's writing in the Greek approaches the classical level of Greek. So he's a highly educated individual, and the purpose of Luke's gospel, and he expresses it himself in Luke chapter 1, he expresses the purpose of his gospel and the purpose of his book, the Acts, is to give us an accurate historical account of what happened during the life of Christ. And in Luke chapter 1, verse 1, Luke says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the world. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So here Luke tells us, he sets us up and tells us that he's giving us a historical account of what happened. Now, it's not about spiritual things necessarily. It's not about references necessarily to things that happened in Old Testament times. This is a current contemporary analysis of what happened during the life of Christ. Pray with me for a second. Father God, we come here this morning, Lord, hungering for your word, hungering for your guidance, Father, hungering for the leadership of the Holy Spirit. So, Father, we invite your Holy Spirit into this place. We ask you, Lord, to fill our hearts with the truth of your word. Fill our hearts, Lord, with the fire for your truth. And, Lord, give us the strength and the courage to take that forward into your world, into this world, to establish your kingdom on earth, Father. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So in Luke chapter 2, we are told that Jesus and Mary go to Bethlehem. We are told that Mary has the baby there. And here's how Luke starts off chapter 2, verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Right? My Keesee over here is lipping it because she still remembers it from the school plays. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth to Galilee to Bethlehem, the town of David. All right, so this is a Roman decree to take and register for a census. The purpose of the census was very simple in Roman times. They did it for two reasons. They needed to know who the eligible men were, the men who in the Roman world who were eligible for military service, so they did it for purposes of conscription into the Roman army, and of course they did it for tax purposes. Augustus, the Roman Empire was very lustful when it came to taxes, and they wanted to collect the taxes from all their provinces throughout the Roman kingdom, and so they issued a decree to take a census. And as a matter of fact, Augustus issued 3 censuses, or he conducted 3 censuses during the term of his reign. 3 different censuses were going on during Augustus's reign. The last one took place in about 14 AD. So that would have been obviously after the time of this particular one that we're talking about here in Luke. And Augustus discovered a couple of facts as a result of these censuses. Suetonius tells us, the Roman historian Suetonius, you've all heard of Suetonius, right? No? Suetonius was the personal secretary of 2 Roman emperors, Trajan and Hadrian. And so he had a front row seat to what was going on during the Roman Empire, and he wrote a remarkable book called The Lives of the Caesars. And Suetonius documented the lives of the 12 Caesars from Julius Caesar all the way through to the end of Domitian, I believe. And so he gives us this remarkable history. And Suetonius tells us that the population of the Roman world was growing considerably during the reign of Augustus. And okay, fine, but there was another fact that was going on. And that is, while the population of the Roman Empire was growing, obviously because they were annexing these various countries and kingdoms, you know, as they were pushing their kingdom out, as they were pushing the empire out, the number of Italian-born citizens in Rome was actually declining. It was going down. Rome itself was losing population. By the time of Christ's birth, the city of Rome had a population of about 1 million people, but 1/3 of them were slaves. Roughly 1/3 of them were slaves brought in from other parts of the world. And of course, the Romans, they were equal opportunity enslavers. It had nothing to do with race. It had nothing to do with color. It had everything to do with the fact that we conquered these people. They are now subject to us, and we're gonna impose our will in every way imaginable, and that's exactly what the Romans did. The process of decline in the Roman population actually began in about the 2nd century BC, and this is about the time that the Roman Republic started to decline. You see, and this was exactly about the time that the Roman Empire acquired its Eastern Empire. They annexed Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, and Syria. All of these countries were brought into the Roman Empire in the 2nd century BC. And as a result of bringing these Eastern cultures into the Roman Empire, traditional Roman values degenerated very quickly. And in fact, they were abandoned. Traditional Roman values, they adopted the decadence of the East. And that decadence was introduced into the Roman culture, again, about 2nd century BC, 250, right in there, BC. And over the period of the next 100+ years or so, it degenerated the culture considerably. The first cabaret girls, just as an example, the first cabaret girls were brought to Rome from Greece. So stop blaming the Italian guys for this. It was the Greeks that brought them in. And that happened after the Second Punic War in about 218 BC is when this happened. The constitutional government of Rome and the republican rule of law that was Rome's history, 400 years of history by this time, was disintegrating. Their ordered society was disintegrating around them, and the end result of all of this was that Julius Caesar broke the republic, created a dictatorship, declared himself dictator for life, and as if all of that wasn't enough, he declared himself to be a god. And Augustus, his adopted son, called himself the son of a god. Now, you know, if you're a dictator and you can pull it off, I guess that's kind of cool, except for one thing. Caesar wasn't a god. All right, there's got that little hitch right there that he wasn't a god. But the fact of the matter is the moral culture that existed in Rome during the Republican era degenerated and it disappeared. Divorce was very easy and it was very common. Young people were not marrying at all, or they were marrying very late. They were reluctant to have children. Most Roman men weren't getting married and weren't having children. Sexual license and promise and homosexuality was everywhere. It was widespread. And in fact, the first professional Roman historian, a guy named Titus Livius, you've all heard of Livius, right? No? Sure. All right, let me come at this from a different angle. How many of you have heard of Dr. Seuss? Raise your hand. Good. Good, because we'll get there. We'll get to Dr. Seuss. We will. Livius wrote Livy. They call him, his friends call him Livy. Livy wrote a remarkable history of Rome in 142 different books. And most of these books were about the size of the various books of our Bible, so they're not like they're giant tomes. But it was a remarkable history that covered the Roman Empire, the Roman world from its inception in about, 753, all the way through to the time of Augustus. Livy wrote during the reign of Augustus. And so he wrote this history of Rome, and much of what we know about Rome, about Rome's wars, about Rome's legal system, about Rome's family culture, most of these things that we understand about Rome come from Livy. So he has had remarkable endurance over the centuries as to what he wrote. And he talks, and Livy was deeply devoted to Rome's republican culture and Rome's moral culture that existed before this decline. He was a very staunch advocate of returning to that. And Livy points out that during the time of Julius Caesar, he says, this is a quote, there were more lustful practices by men with one another than with women. And so he talks very specifically about how this culture had declined. And the perfect metaphor for the decline of Rome's culture became, and this is true in Rome itself, even to this day, the perfect metaphor for the decline of Roman culture was the decadence of the career of the Roman general Mark Antony and his relationship with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. And we know how that was. And so if we go to another Roman writer, a guy named Marcus Porcius Cato. You've all heard of Cato, right? Cato the Elder. Cato the Elder was a Roman statesman about this time of 200 BC. Cato the Elder was one of the leading statesmen of the time, and Cato compared the moral condition of the Roman Republic with the condition that existed about the time that Augustus had taken, Cato compared the condition of the Roman Republic that existed before Caesar, and he is now looking at what has gone wrong with the Republic. And here's what Cato says. You guys want to put up that slide 3? Put up that slide 3, and let's take a look at Cato the Elder here. All right, so here's what he says. He says, this is Cato talking now. He says, I do not think, he says, that it was by arms that our ancestors made the Republic great from being small. It wasn't by arms. He said, had that been the case, the Republic of our day would have been far more flourishing than it was in their times, for the number of our allies and citizens is far greater, and besides, we possess a far greater abundance of armor and horses than they did. But it was other things that made them great, and we have none of them. Now, I want you to listen to this for a second. This is Cato talking about 200 BC, about the decline of Rome. They had other things, and we have none of them. They had industry at home, a just government, a mind free in deliberation, addicted neither to crime nor to lust. Instead of these, we have luxury and avarice, poverty in the state, opulence among our citizens. We laud riches. We follow laziness. Listen to this key point. There is no difference made between the good and the bad. All the rewards of virtue are got possession of by intrigue, and no wonder when every individual consults for his own good, when you are the slaves of pleasure at home and in public affairs of money and favor, no wonder that an onslaught is made on the unprotected republic. This is Cato talking about what was going on in Rome in the 2nd century BC. All right, so how did Rome get there? Now, to top this all off, Rome had little regard for life. They had little regard for life, including, or perhaps especially, newborn babies. You see, Rome practiced what they called Paterfamilias. It's a legal doctrine, Paterfamilias. It literally means the family patriarch. And what that means, very simply, is under Roman law, the father was the absolute ruler over the family. And not just the children. The immediate family, the slaves that were in the family, and the father literally had the power of life and death over his family under this doctrine of Paterfamilias. And what happened in the Roman world is when a baby was born, the midwife would take the baby and lay it at the feet of the father. If the father picked it up, the baby lived. If the father did not pick it up, the baby did not live. Now, they didn't necessarily stab it in the head with a sword, but what they did is they exposed the child, and that's what it was referred to as being exposed. All right, and what that meant, very simply, is they denied care to the child. All right, they denied care to the child. All right, this was very common for illegitimate children. It was common for girls. Girls were not the coveted offspring in the Roman world. They wanted boys. They wanted boys who could be generals and be senators and be knights and so forth. That's what they wanted. Any child that appeared to be sickly, that appeared to be unhealthy for some reason, of course, deformed children, all of these children were left exposed, not provided any care. Most of them were taken to city dumps within the walls of the city. They were left in the street corners. Some of them, many of them, were taken outside of the city and put in the hills, just left in the hills outside of Rome. One of the principal means of gathering up slaves in the Roman world was to collect these abandoned children. Now, of course, later in years, Christians picked these kids up. And it was the Christians that established orphanages. And it was the Christians that were collecting these abandoned children. And one of the key reasons why Rome converted from its rich pagan practices into Christianity was because the Christians were raising up an army of new kids that were abandoned by the Romans. That's one of the reasons they converted. In his preface to the history of Rome, getting back to Livy here now. In his preface to the history of Rome, Livy sums up exactly what Rome had become to this point. He says, I'm quoting now, he says, of late years, wealth has made us greedy, and self-indulgence has brought us through every kind of sensual excess, to be, if I may put it so, in love with death, both individually and collectively. So here we have Livy pointing out that Rome had adopted a culture of death. That's what they did. Livy wrote about it openly. Augustus knew that the culture of Rome was dying, and Augustus blamed three things for this. He blamed the lack of marriage and the lack of having children in the marriages that did exist, exposing of children, what we today would call abortion, exposing of children, and then, of course, homosexuality, because I'm sorry, this is not my rule, don't blame me, you can't reproduce in a homosexual relationship. You can't. And so what Augustus did in recognizing this, starting in about 18 BC, roughly right in the middle of his rule, he instituted social legislation called the Julian laws. All right, and the Julian laws were intended to reverse this trend that Augustus could see was going on. Cassius Dio talks to us, you know, we've all read Cassius Dio, right? Cassius Dio is another historian, another Roman historian. This is what you do when it's 40 below. Cassius Dio talks about these family laws and how Augustus introduced these family laws, and he introduced the family laws in the Roman Forum by a speech that he made to two groups of men that were in the Forum. And one group of men was this unmarried group, and the other group of men was this married group, and Augustus addressed each of them. And he addressed each of them with this speech. This is obviously an edited version of the speech. There's Augustus up there. He's talking to the married men, and he thanks these married men. He praises these married men. He says in that quote, he says, "For is there anything better than a wife who is chaste, domestic, a good housekeeper, a rearer of children, one to gladden you in health and tend to you in sickness, and be your partner in good fortune? And is it not the delight to acknowledge a child who shows the endowment of both parents, to nurture and educate it at once the physical and spiritual image of yourself, so that in its growth another self lives?" And he says, "I love you and I praise you." And these are the married men that he's talking to. And then he turns his attention to this group of unmarried men. And here's what he says to them. "What should I call you? Men? But you are not performing any of the offices of men. Citizens? But for all you're doing, this city is perishing. Romans? But you are undertaking to blot out this name altogether. You are bent on annihilating our entire people, upon destroying and bringing an end to the Roman nation. You are committing murder in not begetting in the first place those who ought to be your descendants. Moreover, you are destroying the state by disobeying its laws, and you are betraying our country by rendering her barren and childless. For it is listen to this, for it is human beings that constitute a city, not houses, not porticos, not marketplaces of empty men. It is human beings. It is human beings." The number, when Augustus made this speech in the Roman Forum, the number of unmarried men in Rome exceeded those of married men. And so these Julian laws, these family laws that we've been talking about, what they did is they set penalties for bachelors. You got penalized for being a bachelor. And there were penalties imposed on childless couples. And actually financial rewards were paid to those who did have babies. All right? Divorce was made much more difficult. Adultery was punished with criminal prosecution, and in fact, you could be exiled from the city if you were found guilty of an adulterous relationship. And Augustus exiled his own daughter Julia from the city, which is ironic because Augustus was no stranger to idolatry himself. But when you're at the top of the heap, when you are the law, I guess the rules don't apply to you so much. And then divorced or widowed women had to remarry within a certain period of time, generally within 3 years. And so this was Augustus's reaction to the culture of death that Rome had adopted. You see, Augustus knew that a culture could not survive if it was killing itself. And that's what Rome was doing. You see, sociologists tell us that in order to sustain a culture, you need to have 2.2 live births per woman of childbearing age. In order to grow. That's how you multiply. All right, that's how you multiply. There has to be 2.2 births per woman of childbearing age. Otherwise, the culture declines. Now, according to the Pew Research Institute, and Pew is a remarkable research institute for gathering facts of any kind in any area. The current birth rate in the United States of America is under 2 children per woman of childbearing age. Now, if the trend drops below 1.5 children per woman, the culture dies and it's irreversible. The trend is downward and you can't stop it. All right, all Western European countries, friends, have a birth rate under 2, and Spain and Italy's birth rate is just about 1. It has dropped below 1.5. Which means that those cultures are in decline and it cannot be stopped. If you want to see the glories of Italy and the magnificent culture that's in Italy, you better get there now, because that country won't exist as we know it in 50 years. It will be gone. The only reason the United States population is growing is what? Immigration. It's coming from immigration. And this is not a slam on immigration. Don't get me wrong here. I'm not talking about immigration good, immigration bad. I'm talking about the hard facts here. The United States population is growing only because of immigration. And the immigration today is not coming from predominantly Christian nations, like was the case in the early 1900s. All right? They're coming from all over the world. They're coming from foreign cultures, and they're bringing their world religions with them, friends. That's what they're doing. All right, that's what they're doing. In my book, Salt and Light, I talk about the trend in immigration in the United States. I mentioned that no longer is immigration, are the immigrants coming from primarily Christian nations. You know, we think of Mexico and Central America as our primary source of immigrants, but that's not the case. In 2015, there are two countries that surpassed Mexico as our chief source of immigrants, and that's India and China. India and China overtook Mexico as the #1 source of American immigrants. And behind Mexico now is the Philippines. So the top 4 countries that are providing the immigrants, they're coming from Mexico, the Central America, the Christian nation, right? Only 1 in 4. And that doesn't talk about the refugees that are coming in. And there are thousands and thousands of refugees that are coming into America every single year. And again, this is not a slam on the refugees. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm talking about the impact that this is having on our culture. Where are the refugees coming from? They're coming from war-torn parts of the world. The primary sources of refugees in America, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Myanmar, Iraq, Somalia, Bhutan, Iran, Afghanistan, Ukraine. Friends, these are primarily Muslim nations. And this is where our population is coming from. And they're bringing the world religions with them. That's what's going on in America right now. And as a society, what's happening as a society is we are ignoring the first 3 commands that God gave to Adam. The very first 3 commands that God gave to man. We're just looking the other way. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 through 31, it says, God blessed them. He's talking about here, well, let's go back to 27. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw all that he made, and it was very good. And there was the evening, and there was the morning, and that was the 6th day. So God gives 3 commands. 3 commands to his created man and woman. Be fruitful, increase in number, subdue the earth, have dominion over it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds and the animals. Man is to have dominion of the earth. Theologians refer to this portion of Scripture as the dominion covenant. This is the dominion covenant. All right, and the dominion covenant is expressed very simply. God intended his created man to dominate the earth and dominate culture and dominate society for the glory of God. All right, God intended his created man to make the entire world a place of worship, a sort of living cathedral to the ongoing worship of God. That's what was intended here. God intended through this command that his kingdom would be established on earth as it is in heaven. That's what he wanted through this dominion covenant. That's precisely what he had in mind. Now, in this regard, there's a couple of points that fly off the page at me here with respect to what we're talking about here. All right, I want to drill into three points. First is the task of taking dominion begins with a very simple command, and that is you have to emulate God's creation process by procreating. He expected his people to emulate that creation process by procreating. He says multiply. Multiply. And he repeats the command in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 and 7. He repeats the same command to Noah after the flood. So 3 separate times, God tells us to multiply. In Genesis 28, and then in Genesis 1:28, and then in Genesis 9 and Genesis 7, Genesis 9:1 and 9:7, we're told to multiply. Now, I had a pastor friend years ago that used to say, if God says the same thing twice, you doggone sure better pay attention. Well, here he said it 3 times. He says the same thing 3 times. Be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 1 verse 28 says God blessed them. God blessed them. Who did he bless? He blessed the man and the woman that he created. That's what he blessed. All right, this is the physical relationship that God blesses, a man and a woman. There is no other physical relationship that's talked about in Genesis or any place else. It's a man and a woman. And here's the thing that's fascinating about that. In every other aspect of creation, God looks at his creation, whether it was the animals, the fish, the birds, whatever, and he says that was good. But when he created man and woman, he looked at that and said, it's very good. This is very good. And it's very good precisely because it leads to new life in God's image. Now, the second point is with the creation of life comes the nurturing of life. We have a responsibility to nurture life. God put his created man, look at this picture. God put his created man in a perfect setting where his every need was met. Every need was met in the garden. He had food, he had water, he had a relationship with his wife. There was no sin in the world. We had trees that were good for food and they were pleasing to the eye. So we had an aesthetic component there. All right, every need was met. He was completely provided for. And Jesus talks about that as well in Matthew 28. Matthew 25, rather, he talks about the need to the requirement of Christians to meet the needs of the people around them. He talks about helping the helpless and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, comforting the oppressed. Right, this is the same concept, helping those around us, nurturing life around us. And we have a responsibility to do this on an ongoing basis so that these people around us might have life. God gave life to Adam and nurtured him in the garden, and we have to help those around us and nurture those folks around us. This is the essence of being salt and light, friends. This is precisely why the left so tenaciously attacks God's plan for life. All right? The left, what they do is contrary to God's plan of creating and nurturing life. The left pushes a culture of death. And they push this culture of death by working to mainstream ideas like euthanasia and abortion and genocide and homosexuality and slavery and radical environmentalism, this radical environmentalism that teaches that man has no place in the world, that we don't belong here, that somehow it was a mistake for man to be on the earth, that in order for the world to survive, we gotta have only trees. There can only be trees. This is what they want us to believe, friends. But the fact of the matter is the one and only way the idea of abortion ever got mainstreamed in America, the one and only reason it ever got mainstreamed in America is because the left was successfully in redefining what that life was in the woman's womb. They simply redefined it. They said, it's not life, it's not a person. It's just a blob of protoplasm, and it might turn into a kumquat, we don't know. But it's not a person. They mainstreamed that idea. They told these lies to these young women. And I know this is a sensitive subject, and I know it's a very sensitive subject, but the fact of the matter is that women have been lied to. Our culture's been lied to. You see, that's why the abortion debate focuses on the woman's body. Well, it's my body, I can do what I want. And you're exactly right. A woman can do whatever she wants with her body. She can get a tattoo, she can cut off her leg, she can do anything she wants. She can. She can do that. But what happens when there's another body involved? All right, then the question changes. And this is why they redirect the debate. Because they don't want people focused on the other body. This was the essential ruling of Roe versus Wade in 1993, is that the unborn fetus is not human. This is what they focused on. They said it's not viable somehow because it can't live outside the womb. What does that mean? What is the definition of viability? Friends, there is no definition of viability. What does that mean? And in fact, modern medical advancements have taught us that premature babies can live healthy and happy and sound lives at an early and earlier point in gestation. We know that to be true today. So what does viability mean? It doesn't mean anything. Viability is an undefinable term, and when we're talking about the law, anytime you have an undefinable term, what we have is what we call an arbitrary term. It's arbitrary. It means whatever somebody wants it to mean. And whenever you have an arbitrary rule in law, it is by definition unconstitutional because it is a deprivation of due process of law. This concept of viability deprives the unborn child of his fundamental right to due process of law. That's what happens here. And this viability thing becomes problematical when you look at some of the 20-year-olds that are out there these days. I mean, they can barely exist outside of the womb, some of these people. That's not funny. I don't know what you're laughing at. The thing is, we've moved past the viability question. We've moved past it. In 1998, a man named Peter Singer became a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. And Peter Singer is the patriarch of infanticide in the United States. Patriarch's not the right word. But he is a leading advocate of infanticide in the United States. And here's what Peter Singer said about this concept of viability. He says, human babies are not born self-aware. They're not capable of grasping that they exist over time. They're not persons. So therefore, the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee. And his focus is on this self-awareness idea. All right, and so because newborn babies aren't self-aware, Peter Singer's position was very simple, that they shouldn't be considered a person until they've been alive for at least 30 days. But where does that line come from? How does a 1-month-old baby understand now that it is a person and that it's got a future? 1-month-old babies don't understand that any more than newborn babies do. And now we're back to this question of arbitrary rules that are by definition on their face unconstitutional. Now here are the scientific facts, folks. The heart is pumping independent of the mother's heart. The motion of the beating heart is visible on ultrasound technology, which didn't even exist in 1993. But you can see it now. Put that video up. You can see it now. I want to show you something here. You see that right there? This little circle right there is a 5-week-old fetus. And do you see that action right there in the center? You know what that is? That's a heartbeat. Now, this is an actual ultrasound from an actually pregnant woman, actually at 5 weeks, with an actual beating heart. Now, you might ask, how do I know that this is an actual ultrasound? You might wonder how I know that this is an actual beating heart. You might ask me that. It's funny you should ask that. This is my daughter's ultrasound. This is my daughter's ultrasound at 5 weeks. And you can see that beating heart. Isn't that incredible? Don't clap for me. I'm not doing the work. She's doing all the work. I didn't do anything. But here's the other thing that is absolutely undeniable. All the genetic coding in that fetus is indisputably human. It's not a kumquat. All right? There is no question that the features and characteristics of this fetus are human. There's no doubt that it's alive and it exists independent of the mother. That heart is beating independent of the mother's heart. And it's not the same being as the mother. It's a different creature. There is no question about it. Now, here's the significance, friends. Ask yourself this question. What is that heart beating? What's it pumping? Blood. It's pumping blood. And what is the significance of that? Leviticus 17:11. Leviticus 17:11 says the life of the creature is in the blood. That creature's alive, that baby's alive. And Peter Singer now, you know, we've gotten to the point where viability isn't the test anymore, thanks to Peter Singer, as I said. That's not even the issue anymore, and we see that now in New York and Virginia. New York passed its so-called Reproductive Health Act, which of course is a complete misnomer. This has got nothing to do with health, and it's got nothing to do with reproduction. It's exactly the opposite. It's about death and not reproducing. Under New York's Reproductive Health Act, the law now allows abortion into the 3rd trimester up to the point of birth, up to the point that the child is born, the moment of birth. And it goes beyond that. We all heard about the moment of birth thing, but the law goes beyond that. Under New York's prior abortion law, a second physician always had to be in the room when a late-term abortion was being performed. Because if the baby was born alive, at the instant that baby was born, it was entitled to medical care, and that second physician was there to attend to the baby. New York repealed that portion of its law. They do not have to have an attending physician in that room if the baby's born alive. It can just be left there to die. The second thing it did, or the next thing it did, is it repealed all legal protections for any unborn fetus whatsoever. So, for example, if a pregnant mother is driving down the road and a drunk guy blows a red light and T-bones her car and the baby dies as a result, under prior law, that person could have been prosecuted for criminal vehicular manslaughter, a felony offense. There are about 32 states in the United States that have those laws on the books. Minnesota's one of them. The unborn fetus is protected from anybody except the mother. Now, under New York law, they've repealed that protection, so the unborn fetus has no protection. And there have been cases now already in New York where pregnant women have been attacked, their babies have been killed, and there's no legal recourse. There's no legal recourse. Now, Virginia, of course, wants to outdo New York. Virginia wants to take it a step further than New York did. Where are my Virginia notes here? Don't anybody leave until I find my Virginia notes. Virginia wants to take it a step further. And again, this has got nothing to do with viability. This has got to do strictly with the mother. And here's how Democrat Governor Ralph Norman explains his situation. He says, if a mother's in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. Notice how he's calling it an infant, which I find ironic. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mothers. There's no pretense of viability here. That issue's gone. We're not even calling it a fetus anymore. Now he recognizes that it's an infant, but now the mother and the doctors are going to decide. So what we've done here is we've moved from Paterfamilias to Materfamilias. The mother is the sole decider of life and death in the culture. She's the one who decides whether the child lives or dies. But have no fear, friends. Democrats are coming to the rescue. Democrats are coming to the rescue. There was a bill introduced in the United States Senate, introduced by Democrat Jeff Merkley of Oregon. He calls for a federal law to ban the use on babies of potentially painful or stressful procedures. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Use on babies of potentially painful and stressful procedures. All right, so we got some hope here. Don't get too excited. Because the Democrats aren't talking about human babies here. They're talking about kittens. They're talking about kitty cats. All right, I'm not making this up. All right, what they're talking about here is a law known as the Kitten Act, which stands for Kittens in Traumatic Testing, ends now. And what they want to do is they want to end the use of kittens and the destruction of kittens by the USDA in their research programs. So these Democrats are all bent out of shape about these kittens. Now, I'm not saying we should go kill kittens. I'm not saying that. But here's the thing that's fascinating about this. Merkley calls the practice archaic and horrific, but he voted against protecting human babies. And as a matter of fact, there's 43 Democrats that support this proposal, and every single one of those 43 Democrats, every single one of them voted against the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act, which would have given legal protection to any baby born alive in the process of an abortion. Every single one of those Democrats voted against it. Now, let me step aside here for just a second and give you a little bit of friendly advice. Stop voting for Democrats. Stop it. I know that's a sensitive subject, especially in this room. If I offended anybody, you can come up to me afterwards and I'll accept your apology. So the third point I want to make here is it's very clear from Genesis that God gave man dominion over the creatures of the world, but he did not give a man dominion over other men. God instructed man to create life through procreation, but he gave no man the power to take life apart from God's law. And this is evident. This is evident in the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, Cain lures his brother out into the field and he kills him. And then he buries him. And in verse 9, the Lord said to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" And Cain demurs. He doesn't want to answer God. "I don't know," he says. "I don't know, what am I, my brother's keeper?" And then the Lord said, like any good cross-examination, any good lawyer in cross-examination is never going to ask a question he doesn't know the answer to, right? God knew what Cain did, but he asked him a rhetorical question. "What have you done?" He says, "What have you done?" "Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Friends, the blood of 60 million babies cries out from the ground. For generations, America was the freest and most prosperous nation on earth. By 1990, by the year 1900, I should say, the turn of the 20th century, by the year 1900, while America only had 5% of the world's landmass and 4% of the world's population, she produced half of every material good that was produced in the world. And I'm talking about food, clothing, housing, I'm talking about textiles, communication, transportation, luxury goods, everything. She produced half of everything. The economic model in the United States and the political freedom that people enjoyed in the United States lifted more people farther and faster out of poverty than any other system in the history of the world. All right? Liberty awakened and unbridled the spirit of creativity in man such as never happened before. The condition of the average man progressed more in 200 plus years since the signing of the Declaration than in the previous 5,000. Why did this happen? Just like Cato asked the question in the 2nd century BC, how did Rome get so great? Why did this happen? How did this happen in America? It happened because as a nation, America followed God's laws in general, and they followed God's laws of life in particular. The founders of our country adopted the Christian worldview on life, and that worldview on Christianity in general and life in particular, that worldview was expressed in our founding legal documents, and it was expressed and ingrained in American society and culture. The Declaration of Independence talks about this very specifically. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by listen to that, all men are created equal." Why are we having a creation debate in America? All men are created equal. Our founding legal document tells us that. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. There are 5 truths in this simple little paragraph. 5 truths. Humans are created by God. They are created equal. God gives them rights, and among those rights that he gives them is the right to life. And they can't be taken away, certainly not arbitrarily. Governments are intended to protect these rights. That's why we have government, to protect the rights of people. Among them, the right to life. Now, these teachings, friends, the teachings that informed the thinking of the founders came from three different sources. Number one, they came from two men, Locke and Blackstone. John Locke was an English theologian and philosopher who wrote two remarkable books. You all heard of Locke, right? Two remarkable books. Oh, we got one hand. That's some progress. All right, so they wrote two remarkable books. And the first book is, the books were called the Treatises on Civil Government. And Locke talks about the rights of man and the right to life in his Treatises on Civil Government. And here's what Locke says. He says, all men are the workmanship of God Almighty. People are God's property. No one may harm another's life, liberty, property, or possessions. And then the second man was William Blackstone. Blackstone was an English jurist, and he was the most widely read of all legal authorities during the founding era. All right, he wrote a 4-volume series called The Commentaries on the Common Law. There were more copies of Blackstone's commentaries sold in the colonies than were sold in England, even though England had a population of about 8 million and the colonies had a population of only about 3 million. During the mid-1700s when these books were released, Americans read, the colonists read Blackstone. And in fact, friends, Blackstone was required reading in every law school in the United States up until the turn of the 20th century. By about 1910, 1920, there were more enlightened sources of law that were being introduced into our law schools, and Blackstone got pushed out. But Abraham Lincoln learned the law by reading Blackstone. And here's what Blackstone says about life. Life is the immediate gift of God, a right inherent in every individual. It begins as soon as an infant is able to stir in the womb. Look, think back to that ultrasound video we saw. Was that infant stirring? Yes, it was. Blackstone goes on, he says, no man has the power to destroy life, but through the law of God, who's the author of life. To do so is to invade the providence of the Almighty. This was Blackstone talking. But the single most quoted source of authority in the founding era, besides Blackstone, besides Locke, besides Montesquieu and all the rest of them that they relied on for their philosophy, the single most quoted authority was the Bible. Historian David Barton studied 15,000 writings of colonists during the founding era. We're talking about letters, articles, pamphlets, books, all these various things. The single most quoted authority, 34% of all primary source quotes in those writings came from the Holy Bible. What does the Bible say about life? It's got a lot to say about life, but let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. God's word tells us to choose life. They talk about life being a choice. Well, it's a choice, all right. No question about that. And look what God says. I call this day the heavens and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death and blessings and curses. Now choose life, he says, that you may live. This is what God tells us. The leftist academians, we've reached a point where we're making a mockery of God's creation. It is a complete mockery these days, friends. Leftist academians tell us that there are more than two genders. First of all, they tell us we got to rely on science. We can't go by that religious crap. That's all voodoo, right? That's all fables. We can't pay any attention to that. We got to rely on science. And yet these scientists tell us there's more than two genders. Where does that come from? I don't know where that comes from. And furthermore, they tell us that a person can change genders. He can switch from one to the other, like changing your jacket. I don't know how that happens. Based on what evidence? What evidence do they have to support that? The answer is none. It's arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary. The University of Minnesota has a department over there. I'm sure most universities in the country have these departments these days. The University of Minnesota has a department called the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life. And no, I didn't make that up. All right, and so they're responsible for helping the university to develop its documents and policies that are, spread university-wide for all students. And so they've come to the conclusion now through this Center for Gender and Sexuality that a student has the right to pick whatever gender they want on their documents, on their school documents. And they give them a number of options. And of course, you can be male or female. I suppose if you're just old-fashioned, you could be male or female. But they give you a number of other options. And among them are non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit. Now, I didn't know you could be two-spirit. Who knew? I don't know. But they don't stop there. They got a blank line that says, enter your own. So you can just make anything up if you want to. And you get to pick your pronouns as well. You don't have to be he or she anymore. You can be none. I don't know how you address somebody as none. You can't call him Mr. None. That'd be offensive. And they have other suggestions called Z or Zer or Zers. Where they get this from, I don't know. I got a sense, though, that they're not studying science. These people are studying Dr. Seuss. They're getting their science from Dr. Seuss. They probably read Dr. Seuss's ABC. You've all read ABC, right? Everybody raise your hand. You've all got, everybody with kids has read ABC. In Dr. Seuss's ABC, we are introduced to the strange creature that lives in the forest called the Zizzer Zazzer Zuz. There he is. It's a real thing. Now, Dr. Seuss did not specify the gender. So I don't think we can call him Mr. or Miss. So I wrote a poem that helps us get our head around this. You didn't know I could write poetry. I'm an Italian guy, it's in my blood. You've all heard of Virgil and Homer, right? Two greatest poets in the world, right? It's in my blood. This is serious now, pay attention. Do we refer to it as Z or Ziz? Zers or Zuz? To get it wrong will cause quite a buzz. Better to ask so as not to offend, and thus you are drawn into the game of let's pretend. And that's what we've reached, folks. We've reached a point in the United States of America. You can clap for that poem. That was good. That was good. It was good. We've reached the point in the United States of America where 2 + 2 in fact equals 5. Or it could be 9, could be 13, could be -3, it doesn't matter. It can be anything you want it to be. All right, because what we are doing here is we are operating our culture and more every day we're operating our legal system on subjective feelings. We have a culture that does not know the difference between objectively established facts and subjective feelings. And this is how we're driving forward. And if you say 2 + 2 is 4, then you are a bigot. You are a racist. That's the point we've reached. In 1831, a man named Alexis de Tocqueville toured America. He toured America for about 10 months because he asked the same question about America that Cato asked about Rome in 200 BC. How did America get so great so fast? This is 1840 now. And this French jurist is wondering how America got so great. And so he toured America for 10 months, and then he wrote a book on his findings, and the book was called Democracy in America. It was released in 1840, and that book was required reading in every university in the United States until about the turn of the century. And it was required reading in a number of studies, history and economics and sociology, all of these various disciplines. And here's what de Tocqueville learned. He personally observed the culture of America, and he personally observed that Christianity shaped the political views of Americans. Christianity defined their views on liberty and government and the law. Christianity formed the foundations of our personal lives, our family lives, our business lives, our marriages. Christianity dictated our moral code and our manners, our public manners. And then he said, Christianity, this is a quote, Christianity reigns without any obstacle by universal consent. And friends, this was true right up until the middle of the 20th century. as late as 1965 and as late as 1975 even. About 95% of all Americans identified themselves as Christians, and about 65% regularly attended some kind of worship service. You could actually walk down the street in America and wish somebody a Merry Christmas and not get sued. De Tocqueville drew a conclusion about how America got great. I talk about it in my book, Salt and Light. And here's what de Tocqueville says. He says, I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her commodious harbors and ample rivers, and it was not there. I looked in her fertile fields and her boundless prairies, and it was not there. I went into her rich mines and her vast world commerce, and it was not there. It was not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness that I understand the secret to her genius and power. America is good. America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. So friends, God is concerned with life. God is so concerned with life that he created life in his own image, that he sustains life and he redeems life. And Jesus himself said, I came that not only that you might have life, but have it to the fullest. What makes anybody think that a God is so preoccupied with life would ever embrace or countenance or accept or tolerate a culture of death? He will not. He will not. And our culture, friends, is in a free fall. We see it in New York. We see it in Virginia. This is not progress. What we see in New York and Virginia is not progress. They call this progress. We've regressed by 2,000 years. We've gone back by 2,000 years. That's what's happened here. And Christians can't watch this anymore. We have to get off the couch. I'd tell you to get off something else, but I'd get in trouble with Pastor Gary. Get off the couch. Get off the couch. People ask, what can I do about this? This is why I wrote the book Salt and Light, is to give you a formula to go out and bring this message to the people around you. And it's a remarkably simple process. We pass out a brochure. We're offering the book here. It's just a $15 book, but you're going to want to give this book to a friend. So we're making a special offer. You can get 3 copies for just $30, $10 a book. And I'm telling you, friends, this is the message that you want to pass out. Don't leave here without taking that book with you. Luke chapter 8 tells us, I'm going to wrap this up now. I promise I'm coming to an end. I promise. Luke chapter, anybody got to go to the bathroom? No? Come on, this is nothing. Wait till I start talking about the IRS. Luke chapter 8 tells us the story of the demoniac. All right, Luke chapter 8 tells us that Jesus gets into a boat and he sails across the Sea of Galilee to the east side. And he meets this man who's living in the tombs. And this guy is an outcast of the quintessential order. All right, he's possessed not by a demon, but by a legion of demons. And in every way, shape, and form, this man is a complete mess. His life is a mess. He's living in the tombs. He's howling at night like an animal. He's breaking chains off his own body. He's harassing the people. He's scaring the townspeople. This guy is a mess, and they don't know what to do with him. And Jesus comes in, and what does he do? He heals him. He delivers him. And he makes a believer out of him. Jesus works a miracle in this man's life, and he makes a believer out of him. And now at the end of the story, we see that the demoniac, the man who was formerly possessed, is sitting at the feet of Jesus, and he's in his right mind. He's restored. Jesus worked a miracle. Well, I got news for you, friends. Jesus worked a miracle in your life too, didn't he? Yes, say yes. Yes. He delivered you from something. He healed you from something. Maybe the Lord worked a miracle by giving you the wife you didn't deserve, who stands with you side by side and works with you through every aspect of family and business. Maybe that's the miracle. Maybe God took your son and brought him through a fiery, bloody war unscathed. Maybe that's the miracle. Or maybe God touched your daughter, who never thought she would have a baby and is now with child and is expecting in November. Maybe that's the miracle. But we've all received miracles. We've all been touched by the hand of God. We all have something to talk about. And here's the message of Luke chapter 8. The demoniac, after Jesus healed him, the demoniac wanted to go with Jesus. He wanted, and who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to follow him? But what did Jesus say to this man? Verse 39, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away and told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. How do you bring God's word to the people around you? Tell them what God has done for you. Tell them what miracles God has worked in your life. Bring God into what you do. You have businesses where you're interacting with people all the time, and there's a perfect example and a perfect opportunity for you to tell these unbelievers what God has done for you. This is what we have to do, friends. And there's never been a more important time to do it. The end. God bless you.
We hope you enjoyed this message from the 2019 Provision Entrepreneurs Conference. For more Kingdom resources, call or visit faithlifenow.com.